Okay, this video is going to be a book review of the book here, Conversations with Goethe by Johann Eckermann, the young writer who got to study with the great German genius Goethe. So this is a picture of Goethe when he was a young man, around the time he wrote, a little bit after when he wrote Sorrows a Young Werther, okay, which catapulted him to fame. Sorrows a Young Werther was a novel about a young guy who had fallen in love with a girl. It was an epistolary novel where he kept writing letters to his friend Wilhelm to tell his friend how much he was in love with this girl named Charlotte. But Charlotte was betrothed to another man whom she eventually married and rejected Werther, such that Werther then committed suicide. And it was a big disaster. And so the lesson from that book was, don't let yourself get so dependent on your love for a woman because she'll reject you and you'll be all sad. There's a lot of fish in the sea. And Goethe himself had said, Werther was stupid, okay? But every young man, I think, goes through that. Like, I remember my high school girlfriend. I thought, she's the one, I'm going to marry her. We're going to live happily ever after, etc. So you get your heart broken and then you live and learn, okay? That's just part of life. Anyway, so Goethe was a good-looking guy. He was, very sort of, the timing was just right. When Werther came out, it catapulted him to fame. The Duke of Weimar loved it so much, he invited him to be his assistant to manage, their province, okay? I'm going to show you some pictures first so you'll have the background to understand Goethe. Goethe right here, here's a painting of him at 37 years of age by Angelica Kaufmann. He's a good-looking, smart guy and was very popular. He was very popular with the ladies and he was well-liked by the men too. Later on, he had a lot of, literature adversaries, if you will, but here was another big turning point in his life. When he was 37 years of age, Goethe went to Italy for 18 months, to study their literature, their painting, their sculpture, their art, their architecture, everything else. And he loved it. And as a matter of fact, he said, my experience in Italy made me a new man. And I think that's an important point, is you want to keep acquiring new information as you get older, keep learning and learning, because you're either growing or you're either developing or you're declining. And if you learn new things, it can open up whole new vistas for it. For myself, I was a conventional doctor, 100%, straight down the pike. And then, all of a sudden, I'm in my mid-30s, I'm fat. My father's sick with coronary artery disease. They want him to go for open heart surgery. My mother is dying of cancer. I'm like, if I'm such a great doctor, why am I fat and my parents sick? I got to study everything else out there, this nutrition, this alternative medicine, all this stuff. And then I'm like, holy crap, this is fascinating. Then I got to review all my biochemistry. So I went back through all that. And what I'm trying to say is that opened up this whole new vista stuff that's now my favorite hobby, all this nutrition and toxicology type stuff to help people get their health back. So anyways, it's good to do something big. He got a sabbatical from the Duke, who paid his salary while he went for almost 2 years to study all this Italian Renaissance culture, literature, and art. Okay, and that had a big effect on him. All right, here is a painting of Goethe going for a walk with Beethoven. So they were both contemporary celebrities. And Goethe really liked going for walks to get a lot of good ideas, he said, during his long walks. And while he was out walking with Beethoven, all these people were staring at them. And Goethe said, isn't it annoying, all these people staring at us? And Beethoven said, what is it to you? They're not looking at you, they're looking at me. He's the big celebrity. Goethe is just a sideshow. It's the opinion of Beethoven. Okay, here's a picture of Goethe when he was older. He's a pretty famous guy that all these people are painting this picture, okay? He's sort of the big cultural man in Germany. And then this would be sort of the picture that goes the most with the book, in the sense that Johann von Eckermann, the guy who wrote the book, was a young writer, really from a relatively poor family, and he just wanted to learn from Goethe. So he came out to visit Goethe, and he just recorded his conversations with him, and then, took only what was best of them and put them into this book. And so Nietzsche, the philosopher, the German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, he's like, oh, this is the greatest book ever written in the German language. I'm going to tell you something. I read it, and how many pages is it? It's about 400 pages. I got to about 176. I just couldn't take it anymore. I studied a lot of Goethe, and I found the book a little bit tedious. And I'll tell you why. I think Goethe was brilliant. He was a genius, but he's also a jerk. I mean, all the German philosophers are kind of screwed in the head. Okay, I say that based on having studied them. I'll come back to that. But anyways, there is a lot of good stuff one can learn from Goethe. With this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. Then I'm going to talk about what's bad about Goethe. And there's a lot of bad stuff about him. But then I'll go back in the end and tell you all the good stuff. And there's a lot of good stuff. He is worth knowing about. He is worth studying, but you have to take certain aspects of him with a grain of salt. I'm showing you these paintings so you get a sense of the man. So when we talk about him, it'll make sense. Let me just show you. This is like his house in Weimar. So he's a pretty wealthy guy. He's a main assistant to the Duke. He collected all these copies of all these paintings. So his home was beautiful. All these artistic paintings, and all over the place there's Greek statues. In his library he had over 5,000 books. You know, he was a real serious scholar. Now here's more like what most of the rooms in his house look like, because I've seen a bunch of videos about his house. He has all these Greek statues, and he'll have some paintings and drawings, you know, copies of things. These are copies of Greek statues. You know, he was wealthy enough to buy copies of statues, not enough to buy originals. You know, almost no one is. But you do get a sense of how beautiful his house was. But the other thing you notice is almost all the statues in his house, they are of the ancient Greeks. And he was, of all the things that he loved culturally, aesthetically, it was the ancient Greeks. And, you know, remember when he lived in the 1700s and the early 1800s, but the 1700s was the neoclassical age. Sometimes it's called Enlightenment, but I hate the word Enlightenment. Enlightenment is a bullshit word. That's created by Voltaire and Diderot and Rousseau, the atheistic philosophes, trying to say we are the age of reason, and not, you know, the stupid Christian irrationals of the Middle Ages, for example. But it's a bogus term because it implies that they were the ones using their reason to do something useful. But in reality, all of those guys, you know, Voltaire, Diderot, Gibbons, Rousseau, they didn't do any science. They didn't do anything academically, scientifically, intellectual. It was the religious fanatics like Isaac Newton, who spent more time writing about the Bible than he did about science, who made the great intellectual achievements. You know, the priests like Copernicus, okay? The 32 craters on the moon are named after the Jesuit priests, for example. Modern scientific method came from the Catholic Church, and all that stuff started way back in the Middle Ages, okay? You're talking about, you know, Arthur the Great, Thomas Aquinas and the Scholastic movement, the foundation of the cathedral universities, etc., okay? So Romanticism, which followed neoclassicism. So consider neoclassicism the 1700s. Consider Romanticism, you know, the beginning of the first 50 years of the 1800s, all right? So Romanticism started to look back more to Christianity and celebrate things like, you know, the King Arthur's Round Table, which is very Christian stuff. It comes out of Celtic Christianity. But anyways, be that as it may, just be aware that Goethe put the ancient Greeks above everything else. He put them above Christianity, above everything else. He found them the most inspiring time. And I can tell you, there's other people who see it the same way. Schopenhauer, the other great German philosopher, he said, you know, the ancient Greeks were a bunch of geniuses compared to the people of our age, you know, 1700s and 1800s in Germany. Okay, here's another painting of, this is Goethe with Schiller. Schiller was younger than him, the great playwright, though Schiller died sooner. Goethe was sort of the mentor, coaching figure for Schiller. Schiller was a magnificent playwright also. Ayn Rand felt that Schiller was a better writer than Goethe. Okay, and there they are in front of the theater. They were Goethe was the director of the theater in Weimar for many years. Okay, now here's a painting from one of Goethe's sort of magnum opus work was Faust. Okay, and Faust is kind of a twisted story, and I'll tell you a little more about it. But it begins with the man Faust, who in reality I think is Goethe, and he was sort of this brilliant scholar, and he was frustrated. Here he is in middle age, and he sort of feels like he's learned all this so-called scholarly stuff and science and theology and all this other stuff. And to him, it almost seems like just a bunch of vocabulary. He's like, what do I really know? What can I do that's useful? And he was so sad and such despair, he almost thought about committing suicide and drinking a cup of poison. And then he looked out the window, and there's the church, and he heard the bells ringing from the church. It was on Easter Sunday, and all the families going to church, and the families looked so happy. And he's like, wow, look at all these happy families. Gosh, I remember when I was young how happy I was going to Mass on Easter all together with the family and seeing my friends at church. And he's like, you know what, maybe there's still hope in life. So that was a turning point the resurrection, if you will, of Faust. Okay, and there is some Christian tone in Goethe, and this is one example of it. Okay, but this is a magnificent painting, Faust on Easter morning. Okay. All right, so now here we're getting to the thick of the story of Faust. Okay, so Faust, in his frustration, is visited by Mephistopheles, the devil, and he agrees to make a deal with Mephistopheles to sell his soul upon his death. To Mephistopheles will take it. In exchange, he gets to sort of do whatever he wants here on earth. Okay, and so what does he want to do? He wants to fool around with a younger woman. Okay, so that is another thing I don't really like that much about Goethe. I think that if he lived today, he would be on Epstein Island. Okay, he wants to seduce these younger women, and for a guy who's sort of like the major literary figure, selling your soul to the devil so you can have sex with younger women. I mean, that's not, to me, that big of a philosophical theme. Other people will say, well, Faust is Goethe's, self in an autobiographical way, and what Gretchen represents is a sacred feminine, and in the end, she sort of saves Faust. By the way, there's the devil Mephistopheles, who arranged things so that he could seduce the young lady, Gretchen. Okay? And there's part 1 of Faust, which is especially about him and Gretchen. Later on, part 2 is a more cosmic. So he wrote this part, he's in his earlier middle age. He wrote the other part later when he was older, sort of this finishing work of his life. One great thing that came out of Faust was Gretchen, the girl spinning the thread to make clothing. And Schubert wrote a great song about Gretchen the spinning girl, and the song has this pattern to it. It almost sounds like a spinning wheel. It's actually a magnificent song. Okay, I'll try to remember to link to that at the end of this. I'm going to do this in several parts because there's just too much material. I think I'm going to make this the last slide of the first part. One of the good quotes I liked about Goethe, and I think he was absolutely right, was he said, we learn from our ancestors. They inspire us to do great things. And what holds together a population, a culture, is their shared story and knowledge of their past. And so he said that, each country has its own past stories, and those are highly valuable to the people. And we should respect them and learn from them. He says, even if a story is not true, but it's now embedded in the public mind, then it's a valuable story. And so one story comes from the history of ancient Rome, the Roman Republic. And this is a story of Horatio at the gate of Tiber Bridge. He was the captain of the guard who guarded the Tiber Bridge over the Tiber River leading to the city of Rome. And they were being attacked by a people called the Etruscans, who had a numerical advantage upon them at the time. And if they had gotten over the bridge, they would have sacked Rome and destroyed the place. So Horatius risked his own life to fight them off as long as he could, to give the other Roman men behind him time to disassemble the bridge. And then Horatius dived into the water, and despite having been wounded several times, he survived. So this is the great Horatius, captain of the gate at the bridge over the Tiber River, okay, fighting off the Etruscans, by Charles Le Brun. Magnificent painting, magnificent story, and there's some great poems written about that too. All right. Now, okay, the next slide is getting into the conversation. I'm going to make this part 2 because now we're going to start diving deep. First of all, we're going to talk about the book. Then I'm going to talk about problems with Goethe. Then I'm going to talk about the great things that he said and did that we can learn from him.